and welcome to part two of narrative performance. What we're going to be working here is to looking at how we collect stories from other people. We listen to stories all of the time, but this particular lecture is going to talk about how we form questions and an interaction that will get us strong, thoughtful stories to embody and analyze. So let's shift. We've talked about how stories are so important. Let's talk about how we collect personal narrative data, because that's what you're going to do first. Is you're going to do an open-ended rather than a structured interview, which means you're going to ask that person, tell me a story about what it's like to live in your body. And you can think of that as, what is it like to be in this particular social location? And that can be based on region. It can be based on race. It can be based on gender. It can be based on sexuality. It can be an intersection of these different things. It can be their ability. It can be their national origin. What does it mean to live in your body? And that's the kind of narrative data we're going to collect. And we can have that pretty open. What we're looking at is, how can we understand culture through the stories you've lived through your body? So we're going to do a phenomenological interviewing, and I have that step-by-step process. You're going to read through what that means. But basically, remember, we experience the world through our bodies. Bodies have similar experiences, and those similar experiences can also have similar meanings. But remember, sometimes they don't. Remember, phenomenological interviewing means the closer two bodies are to one another, the more likely they are to have similar experiences. I'll give you an example. The first study I ever did was on self-identified bulimic women. And I narrowed those phenomenological interviews to women who were white, who were in their early 20s, and who were of middle class and who were enrolled in a university. So here we have this very narrow demographic. Now, I could justify that demographic because that was the group most likely to live with bulimia at that time in culture. But because I was interviewing women with such similar demographics, they also had very similar experiences. There's always exceptions, and know that to remember that different sorts of identities would approach things differently. This was a huge critique of the women's rights movement, because it was so focused on white middle class women that women of color and women who with disabilities, women of lower socioeconomic status, often couldn't identify with this story because this phenomenological experience was narrowed to a particular woman in space and time. And we do much better with that now. We understand that. But in the beginning, we weren't quite aware of that like we are now. Here's some general notes for doing a great narrative interview. First, listen more, talk less. I'm a little bit of an anxious person. And so sometimes in an interview, when there's silence, I'll want to ask another question or fill that silence. But sometimes people just need a moment to process. So take a breath and wait. And wait and make sure that person wants you to ask another question, because people sometimes just need a moment to process. Also, even if they ask you something, try to keep your responses short, because this is about them, not you. You should be listening, not talking. Also, take notes and follow up, but don't interrupt. Trust your hunches. So I'm saying here is, as someone's telling a story, if you're like, I want to know something about this character that they're talking about, don't interrupt. Write down that character's name and know that when there is a pause or at the end of the story, you can go back and ask for some more clarification to understand that. But don't interrupt the flow of the story. Let them give the meanings that they want to for you of what it means to live through their experiences, through their bodies. Also, make sure as you're taking notes that you see their mannerisms. You see different things they do with their hands, with their facial expressions, because as you recreate this interview, just an excerpt of it, not the entire interview, for the class, you want to make sure you are honoring their way of telling this story. So Facial expressions matter, how they move their body. Now, it's going to be a pretty stationary interview, but hand gestures, how their posture is, how their expressions are, how they leaned forward or leaned back, all of that matters. So take notes on that too. Remember, you're audio recording the whole interview because you want to be able to perform a piece of that interview for the class verbatim. So because you're doing that, you want to focus more on the details, the things that are not going to be on that audio recording. Make sure if you need clarification, you ask for it. Don't assume. Ask them to elaborate more if you need to. But again, don't interrupt the story. Do that later. Explore. And I like the word explore. I don't like the word probe. In journalism, we often use the word probe, but probe goes to dissecting. And we're not looking to dissect the innermost secrets of this person. Travel with them. Explore of why this story is meaningful, why it matters to them. Avoid leading questions. And that would be, I bet you were mad, weren't you? Ask, how did you feel? Because maybe they weren't mad. Maybe they were sad. Maybe they were relieved. Maybe they were just too tired to care. And you want to make sure that you don't put what your emotion would be onto them. Avoid leading questions. Also, if it's not going well, it's okay to consider role play. I had a situation where I had traveled several states away to interview a man on what it meant to live through a self-defined disabled body, and the interview wasn't going well. And I found out it was because his wife had only left him a couple of weeks ago, and he was still reeling from that. And I said, well, why don't you start from the beginning of the relationship and tell me the story of that relationship as though I'm her? Talk to her and not me and say what you'd like to say. He talked for almost 3 hours because he didn't really want to talk to me, but he loved an opportunity to process what he wished he could say to her. So that's something you can also do. So here's just some examples of questions in narrative interview, and we're going to craft some of these questions. A narrative, tell me what happened. Where a closed question is, when did this happen? Closed questions aren't bad, but they give very short answers. Also, another closed question can be, why did this happen? Because that takes us away from the story of what to the processing part that doesn't lead to stories, it leads to analysis. So that what is what's going to move us through space. Again, can you take me through a typical day? That's going to get a narrative. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to have a middle. We're going to have an end. Versus, what do you do here? What is that going to give you? An explanation, description that is not a story. Are there any particular moments that stand out to you? That's different. Are there particular moments that stand out to you? Is different than what do you think about this event? That's not a bad question, and it might be a follow-up ending question. But asking about the moment gives you a descriptive, gives you movement. Can you remember any particular interactions? So if you ask for an interaction versus saying, what is this person like? Instead of saying, well, this person is really bossy, they'll say, well, let me tell you this time where they completely overwhelmed a situation. Does that make sense? And that ends our understanding of how to craft and prepare for the narrative interview process. And we will go through those steps in your final lecture of this unit.